Well, the clock says 7, and as the song goes, we'll be right in 7th heaven. Phoenixville Library is excited to have with us tonight the son of legendary rock and roll pioneer and icon, Bill Haley. Our guest tonight is a musician himself, also a businessman, publisher, author, and he happens to live right up the road in Pottstown. Wanted to note something interesting I found out just by coincidence. Tomorrow, TCM, Turner Classic Movies, at 10 in the morning, is going to be showing the 1956 film Rock Around the Clock, which features performances by Bill Haley and his Comets. So you might want to check that out. Right now, to speak about his new book, which he has for sale and will sign for you, and life with his famous father, please welcome Bill Haley Jr.
Wow, nice crowd. How's everybody doing tonight?
Good. How are you?
Good. Okay. Well, I usually ask how many people have heard of Bill Haley, but obviously, and Rock Around, you've heard of the Comets, of course. And how about Bill Haley and the Saddlemen?
No.
No. Okay. Well, you're gonna learn something new today. A couple things I'll say to preface this, and I'm going to tell you my father's story. And then, of course, you can ask questions at any time. Anybody has a question, just let me know. But I like to preface these kind of talks by saying, you know, what we call rock and roll was the coming together of two great forces in American music and American culture. One was what we now call rhythm and blues, but back in the 1940s it was called race music, race records, and country music, which of course we now call country, but back then was known as hillbilly and western. And these were two great musical forms. And they were coming together, they were headed together, and they're all part of more of a larger sociological phenomena that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and so on and so forth. But this was the advance guard of music. So when you say, who invented rock and roll? My answer is nobody invented it. It invented itself. It was going to happen. The question is, you know, who did what, when, where, and how? Bill Haley has the distinction of being there first. He was combining the two forms with the intent of creating a music to get kids dancing like they did during the swing era. That was what he was trying to do. He was doing that in 1949, 1950, and all the other pioneers were 1954, 55, 56, and so on. So, let's get that out of the way. Nobody invented rock and roll. But the book itself was a kind of a labor of love for me for about 40 years, because part of this story will be the personal life of Bill Haley too, which is not as glorious as the professional life, but it's all part of the story. So part of this, for me, was to kind of do research to learn about my father and to understand the circumstances of what happened. So, with all that, let's start at the beginning. My father was born in Michigan, right in the middle of the Roaring *20s, which is appropriate, since he would go on to create a song that would probably exemplify that spirit of the Roaring '20s, fun, good times, rock around the clock. But he started out, and at the age of 4, he lost the sight in his left eye when he had a mastoid, and a crude operation was performed and severed his optic nerve. And his parents didn't realize it until he was about 7 when they moved to Pennsylvania, because the Great Depression was in full swing, and my father's father, my grandfather, was looking for work, so he came out here to Pennsylvania, to Marcus Hook, Pennsylvania, to work for the American Viscose, which was a British petroleum company with operations in the United States. And of course, my father's wife was English, so her father worked for the company and got him a job. So my dad, being blind in one eye, really did not excel at sports, and probably, you know, was teased for that. So he was looking for some escape. So he found an escape as being a singing cowboy. He loved to go to the Saturday movies and watch Gene Autry, the singing cowboy, and so he started playing the guitars. His father played mandolin, banjo. His mother played piano. A musical family. They listened to the Grand Ole Opry every weekend, and so he decided to be a singing cowboy. and he'd wear that hat to just distract attention from his blind eye. So that's what he did, and he got better and better at it, and lo and behold, he entered a talent contest at Radio Park, Wilmington, Delaware, where the Hillbillies acts every week would fill actually stadiums throughout the country. It was so popular, that form of music. And this particular night, Roy Rogers and the Sons of the Pioneer, so they expected about 10,000 people there at Radio Park. And they had a talent hour, and so my dad got to go up there and do his little singing and yodeling act, because my dad was starting to learn to yodel, and he won the contest, and he was off and running. So the next step was to find some bands looking for a yodeling, singing cowboy. And got lucky because there was a band called the Down Homers who were a national act back in those days. We're talking 1946. Of course, TV was barely in its infancy, but radio was everywhere. So radio programs with music were constantly being broadcast from all over. So there was one particular program out in Indiana called the Hoosier Hop or something like that, with a band called the Down Homers, and they were looking for a yodeling singer because their yodeling singer, Kenny Roberts, had been drafted. And my dad applied, and they hired him, thinking they were hiring a different Bill Haley. There actually was a different Bill Haley. He was a yodeler up in the Midwest. Much older than my father, but when my dad called and said his name in the telephone interview, they thought it was him. And then when Shorty Long, the band leader, sent his boys over to pick my dad up at the train station, they walked right past him. 2 hours later, he called and said, where's your guys? And they said, well, they were there. They couldn't find it. Anyway, he yodeled good enough to get the job. But it didn't last because Kenny Roberts came back, so my father, not wanting to be a follower, jumped the band and took a couple of guys with him and started his own band called the Range Drifters. And they did drift all over the Midwest and the South, and fell apart. They were living in the car, coffee and beans, and that doesn't last long. So after a year of that, my dad came home feeling defeated. His big attempt to go out and be a star was a failure, and he really had nothing to show for it. But actually, he had some great experience because he was exposed to a lot of music he would never have been exposed to in Pennsylvania, particularly African-American music performed in New Orleans, St. Louis, Kansas City. And so it got him thinking, and he got back here, and didn't take long, but he got back on his feet and started another band and ended up working for radio stations. And he thought that might be a career for him. So he bounced around from radio station to radio station. Excuse me, a little thirsty there. And he got himself a job in New Hampshire, and then he got a call from his dad saying there's a new radio station starting up in Chester, Pennsylvania, right near his home. And he thought it's a great idea because he just got married, had a new child, and now he can move home and be near his parents. And it was a ground floor opportunity. It was a new station, so he became the program director. He would host talk shows, ladies auxiliary programs, but he would also program all the different music and set up different shows. So it really gave him a kind of a great experience, once again, being exposed to a variety of musical forms and ideas. And it didn't take long, though, for him to get tired of the same old hillbilly grind, and things were starting to trouble with the band. A couple of them got arrested late at night for getting in a fight, and one of them had a gun, which they never would have used, but his band broke up, the Four Aces of Western Swing, so he was kind of down and out, playing by himself in a little place called Luke's Musical Bar down in Chester, Pennsylvania. A couple of guys walked in who were also musicians, one out of Norristown, Pennsylvania, Johnny Grandy, 19-year-old accordion player, and Billy Williamson, steel guitar player. And they were looking for work because they had just finished up with Jesse Stone, and they heard about Bill Haley, and they heard that he had some crazy ideas about music, and that he might be looking for some new musical partners. So they went down there, and they heard him at Luke's, and after the show they asked him to form a new band, and he said, I'm kind of tired of being on the road. This radio thing's working out for me, and I think this might be my career. And they said, well, you know, we heard you were really interested in doing something new. We want to do that too. So they got to talking, and after the second night when they came back, they convinced my dad to join up with them. And the idea was they were going to start a band that was going to find a way to get kids dancing again. And in the meantime, they played all the hillbilly tunes, started getting work, but every day they spent about 2 hours practicing. It was mandatory, and they would go up and get Count Basie records and other kinds of records from different genres and try to figure out, particularly the dance records from the 40s, what got kids dancing. And so they started understanding that, of course, the beat was essential. Instead of the 1, 2, 3, 4, it was 1, 2, 3, 4. So they started incorporating that into their hillbilly songs. So it was a long, gradual process, but before long, they were playing the Twin Bars in Gloucester, New Jersey in 1950. And my dad was, during his radio shows every day, he would hear another 1-hour show, which he actually brought over from another station called Judge Rhythm's Court, where they played race music, 1 hour per day. It was programmed for the air. And Jim Reeves was a DJ, and he called himself Shorty the Bailiff, and he would start off his show every day with a song called Rock the Joint by Jimmy Preston and his Prestonians. Recorded for Gotham label 1949. My dad couldn't get that song out of his head. So one night in 1950 at the Twin Bars in Gloucester, New Jersey, after the hillbilly set, as a joke, my dad turned to the other guys and said, let's do that, Rock the Joint. He said, all right, all you sausages got to get out of here now because we're going to do something we call Cowboy Jive. And they went into a slam band version of Rock the Joint, thinking people would laugh them off the stage. But instead, everybody jumped out of their chairs, started dancing. And next thing you know, every week they're asking to play that song. And so that really lit a spark that maybe we have something here. So even though it was kind of forbidden for a white band to play black music in 1949 and 1950, they started doing it publicly and started getting a reputation for doing it. So there was a guy by the name of Dave Miller who had started a new record label in Philadelphia in 1951 called Holiday Records. He was going to look for some new talent, something different to record. So he was down in the Washington, D.C. area, and he ran into a representative of Chess Records out of Chicago, who said, you know, I have this record. It was recorded by a guy by the name of Sam Phillips, who leased the record in Chess. And it was Ike Turner and the Kings of Rhythm in their band, but the saxophone player wrote the song. So they attributed the song to him. So the song was called Rocket 88, about the Oldsmobile High Dramatic Rocket 88, hottest cars at the time. And Jackie Brenston wrote it. So they made a record of it, and it was a huge hit in the race records markets. But this representative down in Washington said, you know, it's a darn shame I can't get any of the white record stores to carry this record. It would be a hit. I know if we could get it into the white record stores. If you could find a white artist who could cover that tune, you'd probably have yourself a hit. So Dave Miller went back to Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, made some phone calls, and heard that Bill Haley over there at the Twin Bars was playing, you know, race records as a hillbilly band every night. So Dave went over to see him, and he said, Bill, I'll pay you $25 to make a record for me. It was pretty good money for those days. He said, I'll pay your band leads $15. At first, my dad didn't want to do it because he didn't want to alienate his followers, but he said, okay, we'll do it. So they did cut the record called Rocket 88 in spring of 1951, and rock historians will tell you that's probably the first rock and roll record. And you really, with intent, combine those two musical forms and create something new. So they were off and running now. So now they started getting a following for this, but there was a lot of resistance. But they took on a manager by the name of Lord Jim Ferguson, who was kind of also a radio personality. That's how they met him at the radio station. But he had been a boxing promoter, and he had been a merchant seaman. He was trading booze and steaks during World War II all over the Pacific, and just always had his hand in something. So he decided he was going to manage the band, the Saddlemen they were called, by the way. And so Lord Jim's first idea was, look, you guys, you're not going to sell records to the sailors at the Twin Bars. You're going to sell records to the teenagers. So the first thing I want you to do is, I know you're working every morning on the radio station and afternoon, and you're working every night at the bar, but I want you to take afternoons and start playing high schools. So they played 183 high schools for the record office. And it was all about a science experiment to find out what the kids would dance to and what they wanted. So they went to all these high schools in the Philadelphia area and watched the kids when they were playing, and they see the toes were tapping, shoulders were moving, this is worth keeping. Then afterwards they would call, the kids would come up while they were loading their instruments, and my dad would say, well, what do you guys think of our music? And they would give their opinions, and my dad would write down some of these sayings. And one of these events at Eaststone High School, the real tall kid with a ducktail haircut, you know, the blue pants, suede buck shoes, said, crazy, man, crazy. And I wrote that down. Went back to the apartment in Broomall, where he and my mom lived. And he wrote the song called Crazy Man, Crazy, and recorded it the next day. And lo and behold, it became a hit record in 1953, when nobody had any idea what this was, what to call it. The number one song was the song from the Moulin Rouge by Percy Faith and his orchestra. Number two was How Much Is That Doggy in the Wind? But here he got this song called Crazy Man, Crazy, with these guys playing these wild instruments. And it rose to number 13 on Cashbox, number 11 in Billboard. And it woke up the major record labels. There were 3 major record labels at the time. There was Capitol, RCA, and Decca Records. And they, of course, they had a stranglehold, and they would only, you know, record the Percy Faiths of the world. But the success of that song, as money will do, changed some opinions. So Decca Records in particular showed some interest. So they ended up signing with Decca Records. And in April the 12th, 1954, they went in and had their first recording session. And it didn't start well. They took the Chester-Bridgeport ferry across the Delaware River because they were going to New York City. And they got stuck on a sandbar. No cell phones in those days, so they had to wait for the tide to come in and pull them off. So they get there a couple hours late, and then Milt Gabler, the producer, was, you know, a little miffed, but of course he had booked the studio for the whole day. So they got to work, and he formed the band. Well, this song I want you to record, it's going to be our first hit, is a tune called 13 Women and Only One Man in Town. The band had never heard of it. But as it turns out, Milt Gabler owned a piece of it. It was written by a member of Louis Jordan in the Timpani Five, who Bill Gabler had produced for just prior to signing Bill Haley. Actually, if anybody knows Louis Jordan, it was a jump, jive blues band of the 40s, and Gabler produced that sound. And part of his attraction to Bill Haley, who changed their name to the Comets right when they released Crazy Man, Crazy. But his interest in them was based on his interest in Louis Jordan and that danceable beat. So he had a piece of this record written by one of those guys, and took all day to teach the guys the song. None of them read music except for Johnny Brandy. And back in those days, recording, there were no overdubs and such, so they basically had to get together, run through the tune, play it together, get it right. If they didn't get it right, they had to do it again. So they took 7 tries, finally got 13 women, only one man in the can, with 45 minutes left in the session, and luckily they had a tune they had been kicking around, they knew, and they actually were itching to record it because they tried with their previous producer, but he had a beef with the quote-unquote co-author of the tune called Rock Around the Clock. So they didn't need much practice. They did 2 takes of Rock Around the Clock. They left the studio. And didn't think much of it, so the record was released with Rock Around the Clock on the B side, and 13 Women as the A side, and it charted at number 23, but then it sank to the bottom of the ocean like a stone. And that might have been the end of Rock Around the Clock, except they went back in the studio and, less than a month later and recorded a tune called Shake, Rattle, and Roll, which was a big hit for Big Joe Turner. And then they ended up having another hit, and you know, Shake, Rattle, and Roll sold 3 million copies that year. So they were a relatively successful group, and they were playing Rock Around the Clock, you know, live at performances, but basically had been forgotten as a record. But actually, there was one kid out in California, Beverly Hills, whose father was an actor, film that was coming out about juvenile delinquency. The film was called Blackboard Jungle. Right? And Glenn Ford was the actor, and Peter Ford was his 13-year-old son. He was very much into rhythm and blues and race records. He was a big fan of Bill Haley and the Saddlemen and Comets. He loved Crazy Man Crazy. When 13 Women came out, he bought it, didn't like it, but he flipped it over, and he loved Rock Around the Clock. So he played the heck out of that. So, almost a year later, when Richard Brooks, the director of Blackboard Jungle, was coming over to Glenn Ford's house to go over the script lines, and he says to Glenn, he says, you know, we're going to need to find a song to put on the soundtrack of this film that's going to be very controversial and shocking. You know, it has to be the right song. So Glenn Ford said, well, my son Peter's a big music fan. Let's go look at his record collection. And of course, right on top was Rock Around the Clock. So they took that and also a record called All Night Long by the Joe Houston Orchestra and Big Joe Turner's Shake, Rattle, and Roll. Took them back to the studio, shared them with the other executives and whatnot, got the opinions, and we all agreed Rock Around the Clock would be ideal. So when Blackboard Jungle, the movie, was released in March of 1955, with Rock Around the Clock on the opening soundtrack, it was like a cannon being fired for rock and roll. Kids ran out of the theater after hearing that, requesting on the radio station, buying it in record stores. It was re-released, this time on the A side, and by July of 1955, it was the first #1 record in rock and roll history. So basically, my dad had finally reached the top and had created something. Now, right around this time, Lord Jim Ferguson got a call from an old friend of his by the name of Colonel Tom Parker, who had this kid who was on the Louisiana Hay Line, and he was thinking of buying out his contract, and wanted to know if Lord Jim, you know, and my father would take him out, had to get him some experience in front of some larger audiences, and he had not yet been out of the South. So they were actually in Oklahoma when Elvis joined the tour, and after the third night, Elvis knocked on my dad's dressing room door and said, you know, Mr. Haley, I'm a big fan. I love Crazy Man Crazy, and it's one of the songs that made me want to become a recording artist. And my father remembered he had done the same thing with the great Hank Williams, who wrote Shakespeare, when Hank was in Pennsylvania. And Hank was very cordial and encouraged him and showed him a few chords. So, of course, my father returned the favor and took Elvis under his wing a bit for the next week or so, let him drive his Cadillac to some of the shows, and encouraged him. And they became, you know, very good friends. And there was an iconic photograph taken about a month later at Cleveland, Brooklyn High School in Cleveland, which really kind of really shows that transition from my father being the king of rock and roll, and 3 months later, Elvis would be the new king, because he would just hit RCA records and start having #1 hits, one after another. So, but my father still was immensely popular for a few years here in the U.S., and then in 1957, he took rock and roll around the world, the tour of New Zealand and a tour of the UK that, in terms of its sociological impact, it's comparable to the Beatles coming to New York in 1964 when you had Sullivan. In those audiences during that tour were Paul McCartney and Graham Nash and Pete Townsend and just on and on of youngsters of 14 and 15 years old who would be inspired to pick up guitar if they hadn't already, and to consider a career in music. So it inspired a lot of them. As a matter of fact, Graham Nash to this day still carries his ticket stub to that show in his wallet. And his line is, he's lost homes, he's lost wives, but he's never lost anything. It's that important to me. So it had that kind of impact. So my father took it around the world, and then of course, you know, there were tours of Europe, South America, and so on and so forth. So he really was the global ambassador for rock and roll. And in the same sense, because he was the first rock and roll star and out there first and had the first hits, all of the criticism associated with the fears that this new music created, the race mixing, the juvenile delinquency, all that criticism was aimed at my father, and so he was the target of FBI investigations, intimidation, death threats, bombs on their stages during one tour in the South in 1956, when it was my father and 6 or 7 other all-black acts. So he endured a lot of you know, criticism, stress, and he really handled himself like a gentleman and really did defend the music at a time when, I mean, it's, you know, once the fire's lit, you can't put it out. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. But there was a concerted attempt by conservative society to squash this music. And my father did a good job of smoothing that over and assuring parents that it was no different than when you danced to Charleston when you were in essence. And also, personally, during this period when my father went from a yodeling hillbilly nobody to the biggest star in the world and then back down again, he endured a series of personal tragedies. My sister, I call her my sister, but she was born and died before I was born. She died of crib death in 1954. And then shortly thereafter, his mother, who was very close to, died in front of him. His sister died of cancer shortly after that. And then his father died shortly after that. So he had a series of personal tragedies while all these great things are happening to him. He's also suffering. So he really had a lot of turmoil going on. And then on top of that, he had a business empire and some bad advice and some extravagant spending and not wise planning. But basically, he built a business empire, so to speak, with 75 employees, and that all crumbled within a period of a few years. And he ended up turning to alcohol as an escape, and so that really was unfortunately part of the story of the you know, the remainder after those years. He continued to tour and to perform, including a command performance for the Queen of England in 1976, I think, I'm not sure. But it's kind of a tragic story, the ending part, and the personal part is, you know, and I tried to address this as well, my own personal attempt to create some kind of relationship with him, which ultimately failed. So basically that story is, when things started really going bad, and the organization, for a couple of years, really just hung on, 1959, 1960, but by 1961, things were really going bad. So in early 1962, my father basically just fled to Mexico, left behind our family, my mother, 4 children, and then a previous wife and 2 children. And then, of course, all of his business relationships too. And so I had no contact with him at all until the last year and a half of his life. And I actually did try to go to see him when he was supposed to appear at the Philadelphia Spectre in 1972 as part of the Richard Gator Rock and Roll Revival. And unbeknownst to me, my half-brother Jack, his first marriage, was there as well, but my father didn't show up. As it turns out, he was drunk in a hotel room. He couldn't face not just his sons, but the people he left behind in Philadelphia. So this is, you know, unfortunately, it's part of the story, and it's included, and I maybe for perspective, maybe to create a clearer picture, because, you know, my father really does deserve more credit than he gets, particularly here, for what he accomplished and created, what he endured. You know, he's often dismissed, seen as a one-hit wonder or somebody who kind of stumbled onto something, but there was a lot of hard work, a lot of effort and intent in what he did. And then there were a lot of consequences for it too. So he deserves credit for that. But probably the reason he doesn't is his own fault, because he really was a very private person, didn't reveal much about himself, and clearly had some skeletons in his closet as well, which probably contributed to that. So part of this book is just try to talk about the truth as it is, to get a clear picture of who the man was, and maybe it has some value as a cautionary tip for what fame and success can do if it's not handled properly. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Can you read something from the book?
Sure.
What year did he die?
He died in 1981 at the age of 55.
Oh, wow.
And officially it was a heart attack. But I mean, so I had a series of conversations with him last year and a half. Looks like they were usually middle of the night conversations, and it wasn't just me. There was probably maybe a half a dozen to maybe 8 people that he, on a regular basis, he would call. ex-wives, children, whatnot. And they were very difficult because he was usually drunk beyond the point
Where,
of any kind of rationale.
I'm sorry, where did he die? What,
Harlingen, Texas, that's where he moved. So he moved, so in 1962, he left the family, and he wasn't divorced, but he got who would be his next wife, pregnant. So he was in a predicament. Tried to talk my mother into signing off on a divorce, and she wouldn't do it, and lived without some assurance that he would pay child support. So he went ahead and got a Mexican divorce, and got married in Mexico. And then came back later and got my mother to sign a piece of paper saying she wouldn't contest that divorce by offering her $300 in a place where she could get a used car for $300 because she needed the car to get to work. So, so that was that. But he ended up moving to Mexico and ultimately to Harlingen, Texas, with his new family with 3 children.
I read somewhere he had a brain tumor, and that was kind of why he was acting so weird on the phone, and I don't know if that's true or not.
Nobody knows if that's true, okay? But just looking at the facts, my father, and this was part of my issues with my conversations with him, but even everyone I interviewed, my father would make things up his whole life. When it was convenient, not a story. Now, there were times when he claimed he had a brain tumor, times when he claimed he had a heart attack, he claimed that Martha's brothers beat him up because he mistreated Martha. He would say things. There was an incident toward the end of his life, he was performing in Europe, and I'll say this to my father's credit, although his alcoholism really began directly after his March 1957 UK tour. He never, to my knowledge, was accused of being drunk on stage until somewhere in Germany, apparently he kicked a microphone. I don't know exactly what happened. I think his press agent, Patrick Lynn, put out a story about a brain tumor as a cover for his behavior. Which in my opinion was due to his alcoholism, which at that point had gotten to the point where he couldn't control himself before he went on stage. This is my opinion. There's no corroborating evidence of a brain tumor. There were efforts by Martha to have him admitted, told, having more to do with his alcoholism than anything else. There's speculation that there is some kind of genetic predisposition for bipolar disorder. My father's death certificate lists a third cause or contributing cause of death is, as they don't call it bipolar, they call it manic depressive, but there's speculation that there were some psychological components to my father's behavior, and maybe it had something to do with his alcoholism, perhaps. But as far as a brain tumor, I don't believe it. I heard the rumors, but I can't prove it at this point.
When your father first started out, you said he was a white band playing the black music. You said that was forbidden. Did they suffer any repercussions during that time?
Well, just repercussions in terms of trying to direct and indirect. So, it wasn't legally forbidden. There's a cultural taboo. This is really what it was. So every time he did it, he was taking the risk of alienating people who disapproved of it. And there were a lot of them around, even up in New Jersey and Philadelphia, or Delaware, which was mostly country. We don't think of that as country now, but really there were farmers up there. So to the extent that his followers disapproved, there were consequences. But then later, when a lot of the rhythm and blues bands started having hit records, becoming popular and touring it, my father went out and toured with them, then that's where the death threats, they're in Greenville, South Carolina, they're playing, and Lord Jim came up behind my dad and said, don't run, just put your guitar down and get off the stage. And they did. And they conducted a search and they found a dynamite bomb with a timer on it under the stage. It didn't go off. And, but those were real life and death consequences. But but even in the beginning, yeah, I'm sure he lost fans who criticized him for doing that. And he was sensitive to that. I mean, he wanted to be popular. But there's no denying that, you know what, music has no color ultimately, you know, and it just took the, you know, the rest of the world a little more time to figure that out. Although I'm sure a lot of people knew it always anyway. Just somebody has to jump in the pool first.
All right, well, thanks for coming out and speaking about the book, and I got through half of it, and it's a lot of great information, a lot of great history. But looking at Melody Manor, which is like actually Garnet Valley, it's like a Booth Wynn, that was, did Bill buy that after living in Broomall, which is funny because I grew up in Ardmore and you know, it's in such close proximity.
No, so what happened?
The timeline there.
All right, so that, where Melody Manor is, Folk and Bethel Roads.
Right.
When my father's father moved down here first, they bounced around a little bit around the Booth Wynn area, but they ended up buying that 7-acre tract of land where Melody Manor was. So my father basically grew up, or at least his teenage years, living there in what was a converted chicken shack. Really. It had a few bedrooms and whatnot. Then my father got married and separated very early on, so he basically lived in the back of his parents in 1949-50 when the Saddlemen performed. He was sometimes just sleeping in the basement of WPWA in Chester where he worked, 12 hours a day, whatever. Then when he and my mother got together, they took an apartment, Broomall.
Oh,
Okay, so that was 1950. We were married in November of 1952. And they lived in the chicken shack briefly before they were married together. Okay, but then they got an apartment together when they were married. And they stayed there until 1954 when DECA checks started coming. That's when my dad built Melody Manor on the same land where the chicken shack
Okay,
was.
right.
So he basically moved back home. And then their dream was to build a home on that land, his father's land,
Right.
which is what they did. And then we moved into Melody Manor in September of '54.
Right. And the one thing that I learned this late as where between Columbia developing the long player and RCA developing a new type of format, being the 45.
45,
So I guess Elvis Presley, all his records had to have been basically on 45s, and you know. And Decca, the first one was on a 78.
The first release of Rock Around the Clock, which incidentally, they didn't know what to call it, so if you look at the label, it's a foxtrot with logo chorus.
On the 78.
On the 78 RPM record. When they re-released it in March of '55, after Blackboard Jungle, it was a 45.
Right.
So the technology had changed within that year.
Very interesting. Thanks.
How much did you get to see your dad perform?
I never saw him live. I tried to go that one night in Philadelphia Spectrum, but I never saw him live. And he wasn't really in this area much. You know, and I don't know if he had just avoided it or, you know, I'm sure he did. Part of the Richard Nader revival tour was pretty huge. And they would come to Philadelphia, regardless if he was coming or not. And he was part of that tour. So, you know, obviously, he just screwed up and didn't show up. And he tried to blame. So here's what happened. So I was in the audience, but I was, I don't know, 19 at the time, 18 or 19 years old, maybe something like that. My older half brother was also there, unbeknownst to me. Well, he went backstage, and they told him he could show up. So Rudy, my dad's sax player, was a very nice guy, my dad's best friend. Rudy said, "I'm sorry, Jack." My brother's name was Jack. He's back at the hotel with Howard Johnson's joint. And Jack made Rudy take him back with him. So they went back and they knocked on the door, and my dad was passed out drunk, a couple of Jack Daniels bottles next to him. And they woke him up, and my dad got up and took a swing at Jack. And Jack told me the story. And Jack asked him why he didn't show up, and so he just started making up stories, like that was it.
Yeah.
So first he said that a couple of mobsters threatened him, don't show up or kill you. Then he said that Richard Nader didn't pay him for playing in Madison Square Garden the day before. But you know it was nonsense. He was just But that's the way my dad was. So somebody asked earlier about the stories, you know. That the hardest part of writing this book was getting so many conflicting stories, and even written sources. And some of them, you know, made a lot of sense, but you know, it's hard to decide for sure what's true and what's not. So a lot of stuff, well, this started out 150,000 words and ended up 80,000 words. There's a lot of stuff that never made it in for a lot of reasons, but part of them is you just don't know. You know, a lot of interesting stories, but you just don't know. And of course, everybody tries to take credit for being the one who was there, influenced them, thought of this, thought of that. It was me. I did it. So, and particularly, you know, the worst of all, and unfortunately, is somebody who really should get probably a lot of credit, which is James Myers, who's credited as being a co-writer of Rock Around the Clock. And he later admitted under oath in deposition that he paid $500 to put his name on there. Now he ended up getting super rich from it. But the point is, that undermines his credibility, and there's so many other things he was involved in from the beginning. When he was a partner of Jack Howard in the early Cowboy days, he put up money for my dad to do some of those early records. He was the guy who went and negotiated the contract with Decca Records to get my dad signed it. So Jim Myers deserves credit, but he then has made so many outrageous claims related to his role that you almost want to leave anything he says out because his reputation is so tainted. So that's the hard part, is the balance of what's true and what isn't. And now there's another project ongoing. An acquaintance of mine, his name is Chris Gardner, in England. It's just a retired patent worker or something, but I regard him as like the Haley expert. Maintained websites for years and years. He's continuing to do research, so I continue to find things out, and you know, and things get verified too. They suspect, but so it's a long process of figuring out. And many people don't care about the tedious details. I get that, and so I wouldn't put them in for that reason. But even just important stories, you know, where people should get credit for something or that adds more insight, it's hard to determine exactly what's true and what's not.
Well, your dad, did he work on music was his whole life? Did he ever work factory work or anything anywhere?
Well, when he was a teenager, right out of high school, dropped out of school in 10th grade, and he briefly worked for a Baldwin Locomotive Company, and also for the Bethel Springs Water Company. So he would drive a truck with spring water, I guess, to the Jersey Shore and back. And that lasted maybe a year or so, and then until he started getting opportunities to perform and make money. But his aspiration was always to be a performer, and then he really did think he would be a radio disc jockey, and that would be his career at a certain point.
First of all, you look like your dad.
So, yeah.
You really do. I seem to recall that when Bill Haley passed, the group was still around as Bill Haley's Comets or something similar to that. Can you talk about that, if that band's still around, and who owns the name?
Yeah, so, I don't know how far back you want to go with this, but one of the banes of my father's existence, and also, you know, something that really contributed to his career was, you know, management and booking agents, okay? So there was one agency in particular who I left out of the book by name, because we don't want their descendants to, their estate to, I don't know what the legalities are, but better do not take a chance. But I'll say it here, the Jolly Joyce Agency. And they got him a lot of work in the early days, but they also just, through greed, I don't know the particulars of it, whether it was an insistence on taking all the commissions and not splitting it, so therefore losing all kinds of work, making promises they couldn't keep or didn't keep. My father ended up having just a very, very strong vitriolic anger toward Jolly Joyce Agency, okay? To the point where, I don't know if anybody who's read the book here will read it, but there is one scene in the book where my father's alcoholic, the worst part of the marriage between my mother and father, he was so drunk, he came at my mother with a knife. The only time ever he was in any way violent, but he came at her with a knife, he thought she was Jolly Joyce in his anger, okay? And he ended up trying to leave Jolly Joyce sued him, they countersued, they won the lawsuit, and then Jolly Joyce talked him into re-signing with him. So when he left, I'm telling you all this for a reason, when he left, and I told you he abandoned the family, he abandoned everybody, well, Jolly Joyce went to court and said, well, I want control of this name, and Bill Haley's not showing up to defend it or ask for it, so he got some kind of legal control of the name. So for years, he put out bands called Bill Haley's Comets.
Right.
Which maybe had one or two guys who played with my dad for 15 minutes here and there. Maybe Al Rappa, who was a bass player for longer, but he didn't even join the band, so way after the day. So in my view, it was a ripoff. It wasn't Bill Haley. But they did it for years and years and years legally. Then, early 80s, I don't know the exact year, some of the original members of my father's band, the Salmon and the Comets, decided to get back together and reform and call themselves the original Comets. And started touring, and they were sued by.
Oh, you're
Okay?
kidding. Wow.
To the best of my understanding, the ruling was that the name Comets is at this point a generic name for this type of music. And as long as there's a distinction, there's no infringement. And so for that reason, there are other Comets, including my own. I put together a band after a whole life deciding, resisting, that I wouldn't, for many reasons, you know, for my own, all kinds of reasons why. I had a lot of stuff to work through, but anyway, the opportunity finally presented itself. I was at a point in my life where it's now or never. And so I was approached by a booking agent. He said, if you put together a band, I can really get you some nice support. And we toured New Zealand, we played all over the United States, I played in Europe. So it worked out, but the point is, I can use the name Bill Haley Jr. and the Comets. There's a European Bill Haley's Comets, there's the new Comets, there's the Comic Combo, the latest one in England now. So it's now become a generic name.
Are there any original members still alive of the group?
There's two still alive. Al Rex, the bass player, in Norristown, and Joey Ambrose, the saxophone player, who was in Las Vegas. And just recently, the drummer Dick Richards passed. And Dick and Joey were actually still performing up until about a year ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, with Sean, with Bowser. Bill Turner and Joey Ambrose and Dick Richards, who just passed away. They were performing up to a year ago with Bowser and Sean. Not, I don't think, you know, all the time, but just one-offs in Jersey Shore and up at New York.
Okay, thank you.
I have another question. When Bill Williamson, the two guys who were in Norristown, and
Johnny Grandy and Billy
Johnny
Williams.
Grandy, but Franny Beecher also, was he friends, was he working with them, like how that started?
Well, you know, they kind of all knew each other. Franny Beecher was playing with Benny Goodman.
He'd be like 100 now. He's going on to 20.
Yeah, well, he was a youngster then, but he was playing mainly jazz, but he also played with some hillbilly outfits. He played with the Buckaroo Ramblers in this area. So they kind of knew people, but when the Comets went in the recording studio, they didn't use a lead guitarist in live. Billy Williamson played the leads on steel, or my dad did a little, shuffle rhythm,
Right.
kind of thing. But on records, they would use my dad's friend Danny Cedrone,
Right.
from the Esquire Boys in Southwood. So this is in the book, the story of Danny Cedrone. He was a great guitar player, had a band called the Esquire Boys. But it was a friend of my dad's, and he would come in and play on the records when he could. And occasionally they used a different session guitar player when he wasn't available. But Danny played on Rock Around the Clock, that classic lead guitar solo that everybody, needs to learn, the guitar player. And then he recorded the next session a month later and produced Shake, Rattle, and Roll, okay? And then he did a job with the Esquire Boys. Now, I'll give you just a little background. Danny Cedrone was from South Philadelphia. He was not a member of the mob. We played in nightclubs, and the mob controlled the nightclubs. They controlled the jukeboxes. And Danny and the Esquire Boys had recorded a song called Caravan, and did their own arrangement. And it was constantly playing on the jukeboxes. but the mob didn't pay out to the artists for the jukeboxes. They confiscated the first 4,000 records, whatever. So Danny wasn't happy about that, and he would speak out about it. This is what I've been told, and I don't know, and this is not verifiable. I know we're talking about verifying, so I mean, I just get from everybody I talk to doesn't want to talk. This is the influence. But Danny was just kind of mouthing off, and the point being, he went out and got some roast beef sandwiches after a show with the Esquire boys, and they found him at the bottom of the flight of steps at the 801 bar on Snyder Avenue, with a broken neck. A bag of roast beef sandwiches sitting there. So so that's what happened to Danny.
Right.
So the next time they had to do a recording session, you needed a guitar player. That's when they called Frank Beecher.
Right.
Franny was known to Billy from Conshohocken and to Johnny a little bit, but Johnny was the younger guy. Johnny was 19 and Billy was kind of the leader. Billy deserves a lot of credit, I think,
Right.
for driving the band and encouraging the band to listen to black music and to emulate it.
Mhm.
You know, it wasn't just my father telling these guys what to do. They were partners. And Johnny was more of a follower, a willing participant, and added a lot. But Billy deserves a lot of credit for that too.
Right, just one thing, that I always like to believe that the Esquire boys were like a Decca kind of, you know, they're musicians at the studio in New York, which isn't really true. They were a duo.
They were a duo from Philadelphia.
From Philadelphia.
And I don't know, because the drummer, same deal. And they used a drummer from New York, Billy Gusak, who was
Yeah.
a jazz drummer. I don't know if using Danny Cedrone was Milt Gabler's suggestion because he had used him or knew about him, or my dad's suggestion because my dad knew him and was friendly with him. I think more the latter, but I'm not sure.
Right, but it is, the solo is kind of like, is it this Rock Beatin' Boogie? There's like the song that's very similar that.
It's exactly the same, Rock the Joint. So
Rock the
so-
Joint.
So the song they were playing in the bar
You know.
for a joke, and
Mhm.
the big hit. Dave Miller, who was still their producer at Essex Records,
Mhm.
Holiday became Essex, had a song, and this demonstrates for you what I was trying to say earlier, how it was a transition, and it wasn't easy to just switch from one form to the other. So Dave Miller said, I got this song, you know, Hank Williams' Cold Cold Heart was a huge hit. And it was covered by Tony Bennett, and it's just a huge hit. Well, I've got this song. It's going to be another Cold Cold Heart. Go AC. I want you to record it for me. So he went in and recorded it. Well, on the flip side, they needed something to put on there. And it was the same with Rock, like with Rock Around the Clock. Oh, well, we know that song. Well, we know Rock the Joint. We play it all the time. Well, that's when Danny Cedrone laid down that guitar lick. Okay? So when it came time to do Rock Around the Clock with 45 minutes left, once again, I don't know who said it. Marshall says he was the one. Joey says he was the one. Somebody else says that my father and Danny got together that week and decided that they were going to do the same guitar solo. Or Danny thought of it himself. Well, for whatever reason, time or suggestion, Danny decided, I'm going to play that same solo I did on Rock the Joint.
Right.
Rock Around the Clock. Note for note.
One last thing, I read in the book where they liked the vocal performance you had on one, and they kind of spliced the music. Was that on the when it was redone?
Well, that was the theory, and then once again, there's several versions of it, and you look for Milt Gabler's version, because he was the guy who did it. And I think I saw in my research, there was one letter, he was answering a question of a reporter or something. And I think his account was that he used a tape and spliced the tape. So they
Yeah.
couldn't do overdubs, or they could, I guess, theoretically.
There's like 2-track.
But it was before they did it as a matter of engineering.
Right.
And incidentally, Crazy Man Crazy, way back in '53, the producer of that record was a guy by the name of Tom Dowd, who went on to play on just about everybody's.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this is when he was just a young guy.
Universal
Nobody,
Radio.
from nowhere, right.
When your dad passed, was there a service for him, and were you or any of your family members able to be there?
There was a service, but no, we were not able to be there. We weren't invited, and my father wrote us out of the will. I don't know if that was Martha, his third wife's influence, or of his own decision, but obviously there's some tension there, and it was a confusing time for everyone. It was unexpected. My father called me the day before he died, and he was really upset. He was actually been upset for a couple of days. He'd been calling about his wife Martha had kicked him out, he said. Now apparently he was just living in the pool house behind the house and she was inside or whatever. I know at one point she moved out with the kids and then came back, so there was a lot of marital strife going on the last few months of his life. So he called me the day before he died. He was really upset, and he wanted me to call her for him and get her to get on the phone with him. I don't know what he wanted, but I wasn't going to do it. So I never talked to her. Then he died suddenly. There was no communication. There was no, hey, there was no announcement to us when or where the service would be. We found that after the fact. My mother actually did hire an attorney just to look in to see what's going on here, and that's when we got a copy of the will showing that he explicitly, not just left us out, he excluded us specifically by name. So there was no point in going down, and there was no warning. And also, for me personally at that time, I was harboring a lot of negative feelings toward my father. And so my reaction was to publicly not make any comments or make any appearances or say anything. The phone was ringing from reporters, and I would just say no comment.
How old were you in '81?
24. I'm sorry, 26. Can't do math too well. 26, yeah. Yeah.
Where's your dad buried?
He was cremated,
Cremated.
and supposedly his ashes are in an undisclosed location.
By his choice?
Wife's choice.
Wife's
Her
choice.
wife's choice.
And where is she today? Do you know? You probably don't.
They lived in Harlingen, Texas. I don't know if she stayed there or moved or what happened. I would assume she's still in that area. The three children are out and about that I know. I have no connection with them. I've kind of, it's like, once again, it's kind of awkward. My father's third child by Martha, so she would be my half-sister, Gina, is a performer who's out and about performing. And so she actually messaged me on Facebook at one point and said, hey, brother, I've been watching you. I said, oh, great. I see you're performing, and I'm doing that too. Great. So here's my email address and my phone if you want to try. I never heard anything from her, so I don't know how to take that, but I don't have a strong desire to create a relationship. There's a lot of dysfunction that goes along with it, unfortunately. Feeling you're discarded by your parent. So for that reason, I don't actively pursue those connections. Although I'd be fine if they wanted to reach out to me and connect, that'd be great.
I wanted to ask about your process writing the book. You had so much to research. Did you start writing it and then realize you had to research, or?
It really started as a term paper in college. And gave me some motivation to start doing some research about my father. But back in those days, it was before computers, and so I would go to libraries and mimeographing, Haley News from England copies, and then I started conducting interviews, tracking down the ex-musicians and recording the interviews, which are very valuable today, actually. And then I started doing extensive interviews with my mother and my father's business agent, who really were the main sources of the need of the book. So it was a long process over many years, so I would write parts here, parts there, and try to organize it chronologically. But the most frustrating part was, once again, getting several versions of stories, and now how do I fit this in there? And not just different versions of the stories, but even more maddening was different time frames for the same story. So, you're looking at 150,000 words, and this story appeared here, and then, wait a minute, do I have it 2 months of, So it was a long process, yes.
Was your mother a performer?
No, she was working in as a dipper in a chocolate factory in Camden when she met my dad. Yeah. And then when my dad left, she really didn't have too many skills. I mean, she had some inkling that more than an inkling, she could see the writing on the wall as the marriage was dissolving and the empire, the business was crumbling. So she started taking like courses in etiquette, typing skills and whatnot. And then she had helped out on the switchboard with the Comets organization. So those were really the only work skills she had. So she ended up working as a hostess, you know, in a restaurant, but eventually getting a job with then Bell Telephone. And as the company grew, they were looking to give women in particular opportunities to move into management as part of their you know, their outreach program, whatever. So she went into management and ended up having a nice career as a manager for AT&T, or you know, whatever. And she's still doing very well today. She's living in Bluebell.
Okay,
Wow.
She sounds like she was a great mom.
Yeah. Thank you.
My wife and I and another couple saw you and your Comets play last spring at a doo-wop and oldie show at Pottstown High
yeah.
School.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
And we saw you do Rock Around the Clock. You sounded just like your father. But I might ask you how you got invited there, and did you enjoy playing there?
Well, yeah, Tom Coyle hired me for that. And actually, Pete Mastropolo, he's the band director for, I guess, the house band for those shows. He's hired me for a couple of things up in New York, in that area. And we're actually going to be doing something in Bristol coming up in August, I think. So, yeah, it just worked out that Tom, I ran into Tom at the post office. He said, how much to hire you guys? That's not going to do, Tom. And it worked out, so, yeah. Yeah, great guy, great group of people, and we love doing it. Of course, that's easy work for us. It's 20 minutes, man, bang, bang, boom. We usually do a 90-minute show, and I tell a lot of stories in between shows. And I'm actually developing a one-man show. I'm working with a producer out in California to do something more story-intensive with photographs that illustrate specific points in the story. And then some live music. I'll have an acoustic guitar, and an upright bass player, and another guitar player. So it'll be kind of a one-man show. Yeah.
Do you have a website and do you still perform locally? How can we
We
find
do.
out?
We don't perform that often. We're actually going to be up at Mount Airy Casino in April.
Where are they gonna be down there?
But yeah, not too much. We're doing some fairs out in Berks County. We have a kind of a local agent who gets us some jobs out there. And I'm working on this one-man show in particular. We're going to do that in June out in California. BillHaleyJr.com. And Facebook is Bill Haley Jr.
You ever meet Elvis?
Did I?
Yeah.
No. No, when I was actually in college, it was 1976, I was in college. And I was traveling in the summertime, and I saw the headline, Elvis died. I always called back on Sundays to my mom to say, hey, I'm still alive. And I was doing a Greyhound Americas, traveling around America, backpack. But anyway, Elvis died, and she goes, oh, your father called. I said, oh. He goes, yeah, he wanted to let us know he was still alive in case we saw the headline that the king of rock and roll died. He wasn't joking. Well, I never met him. Now, I told you the story of when they met, okay? So now, a couple of years later, 1958, Comets did a tour of Europe, and things had started going bad. So, talk about bad luck. They get to Europe, first stop is Italy, and the Pope dies. So shows in Rome were canceled, the rest of the shows are poorly attended. So then they go to Spain, they do one show, lines around the block, and Generalissimo Francisco Franco decided that it was immoral and blah, blah, blah. And so all the lines the next day to get their money back for all the rest of the shows. Then they go to Germany, and there are riots. There are East German kids coming over trying to cause trouble. So this tour is a disaster. And at the same time, my mother and father were having marital difficulties, and my mother suggested trial separation before he leaves. He had an affair that had fizzled out. He was at an all-time low, and backstage in Germany, and he says to Lord Jim, I don't want to talk to anybody. Somebody knocks on the door, and he said, I don't want to talk to anybody. And Elvis Presley was stationed in Germany, and he came to the show. He came backstage, and he lifted my father's spirits, and Ralph Jones, who was there, told me that he said, my father said, Bill, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't even be in show business, so don't ever give up, you know, kind of thing. So Elvis returned the favor, and even though Elvis knocked him off his throne and stole his thunder and supplanted him as the one, like many people who, you know, just have peripheral knowledge of rock and roll, assume Elvis created it, you know, or Chuck Berry, or whatever. But Elvis in particular, my father was the biggest star, and then a year later Elvis was. So my father had mixed feelings his whole life about it, but personally, Elvis really, he loved, admired Elvis, and respected him, and appreciated him.
Also, Bill, you know, the Beatles and Paul McCartney have been quoted, and you looked up at Bill in the comments like his dad, and, you know, there was I was in Hamburg, you know, at the Star Club on Grosse Freiheit, and there's a picture of Bill playing with Al, but he's there, and it was like in 1962, and I think that's when John Kay, I think, was on guitar, and they did a couple of shows, and you know, the Beatles were like the house band when they were had 10-year
6 months earlier, they had opened the club, the Beatles, and then my
Yeah.
father was there after that. But you know, speaking earlier about the '57 tour, Paul McCartney has a story where he was the only one of his mates who could scrounge up the 14 shillings or whatever it took to get the ticket, and skip school the day before, got in trouble, but it was well worth it to him. So yeah, they were all profoundly affected. Now, obviously, they got into everybody else right away too, but that was the wake-up call for a lot of them.
Right.
Tom Jones, I mean, he goes on and on.
And those records came from New York to Liverpool, being a port city, a lot of times before they reached London. you know.
True, and that's once again the sailors
Right.
carried, yeah.
Great history.
Yeah. Well, I do have some books, if anybody is interested, happy to sign them. And any other questions, happy to.
Thank you.